They introduced me as Marta, their longtime housekeeper. I heard it before I saw the faces, 12 pairs of eyes narrowing, smiling politely, but not warmly. The words fell like a slow cold rain in the room where I once thought I belonged. It was a winter evening, a dinner party full of polished people with polished lives, and I was the shadow in the corner, the invisible helper carrying platters, refilling glasses, but not a woman, not a mother, not a grandmother, just Marta. The house was hers, the daughters, shiny floors, crystal chandeliers, the kind of place where laughter sounds rehearsed and everyone knows their role. But here I was, wearing a borrowed apron and a quiet ache that no one bothered to notice. My hands trembled slightly as I set down the last dish, and I heard the soft murmur of a guest asking, "Is she the help?" Before the daughter answered quickly, as if trying to erase me from the room, "Oh yes, she's been with us for years." Years. That was the word that stabbed hardest. Years of dinners cooked, birthdays celebrated, tears wiped away in silence, only to be reduced to a convenient story for perfect strangers. I stood still for a moment, the weight of the dress I had worn that afternoon suddenly feeling like a costume for someone else's play, a costume I'd worn so many times I forgot who I was underneath. I am Marta, though not the Marta they see. I am 76 years old and now live alone in a small sunlit studio near the train tracks. It smells faintly of cinnamon and old varnish, smells that remind me of the kitchen where I used to knead dough for my granddaughter's birthday cake, the same kitchen where I was no longer welcome to sit and rest my aching bones. My daughter's house was full of life, but not for me. I was the quiet ghost drifting between rooms, the familiar stranger who polished silverware and set tables, but never took a seat at the feast. The dining room where that night's party unfolded was cold with the glow of crystal and candlelight, but it was colder still to my heart. I remember the precise way the daughter smiled, a smile that did not reach her eyes, the same eyes that avoided mine every time I looked up, as if afraid to recognize the woman who had given so much of herself for so many years. I remember feeling the weight of the stares, the murmurs, the polite questions that sought to confirm the story the daughter told. "She's the housekeeper." As if that simple phrase could wipe away decades of shared memories, of love given and overlooked. I was the unpaid labor disguised in soft cotton gloves, the invisible hand behind every celebration, every holiday, every family dinner where my name was never spoken. I did not speak that night. I did not cry. There was a strange stillness inside me, a hollow calm that comes only when the heart has been broken quietly too many times to count. The guests chatted around me, their laughter tinkling like fragile glass, and I moved between them like a shadow, serving drinks, carrying plates, pretending that the sting behind my eyes was just a tired reflection from the overhead chandelier. It was not the first time I had been erased, but it was the most public. The daughter had carefully curated this image, the one she wanted her colleagues and friends to see. A polished life, a perfect family, and an older woman who belonged somewhere else, preferably out of sight. I wondered, in the quiet moments between serving salad and pouring wine, how many others in that room saw me as I was. A woman who had sacrificed pieces of her own identity to build a family, only to be told, in a single sentence, that she was no one. Marta. Not mother, not grandmother, just Marta. Later, when the guests left and the house quieted, I sat in the empty kitchen and let the silence wash over me. I took off the apron and folded it carefully, placing it on the counter beside a faded photograph of my daughter and me, taken years ago when the world seemed kinder. The walls echoed with the faint scent of rosemary and citrus, a stark contrast to the bitterness in my chest. I looked around at the immaculate space, at the polished silver and the crystal glasses waiting to be packed away, and I realized how far I had drifted from the woman I once was. The woman who had baked bread with her own hands, who had sewn costumes for school plays, who had held her daughter's hand through every scraped knee and broken heart. That woman had been slowly erased, replaced by an invisible presence, a helper, a shadow named Marta. I am 76 years old, and though the years have folded their stories into my bones, they have not yet stolen my voice. Now, in this small room smelling of cinnamon and old varnish, I am learning to speak again. The night of that dinner party was a fracture, a sharp crack in the foundation of my life, but it was also a beginning, because beneath the weight of invisibility, beneath the quiet erosion of my identity, there is still a woman who remembers how to stand, how to speak, how to reclaim her name. Marta is not a housekeeper. Marta is a woman who once dreamed of being seen, not as a shadow, but as herself. And now, with each breath, with each step away from that polished dining room, I am becoming that woman again. The night I realized the distance between us was no accident came quietly, wrapped in the hum of polite conversation and clinking glasses, but its impact struck deep and without warning. The catalyst that shattered whatever fragile illusion I had left unfolded not in a dramatic confrontation, but in the small, merciless details that slipped through the cracks of that evening's carefully constructed facade. I had spent the afternoon preparing for that dinner party much as I always did, chopping vegetables, stirring sauces, and setting the table with a care born of decades of loving labor, the kind that goes unnoticed until it is absent. The house was alive with laughter and chatter, yet I was already a ghost in my own story. I moved through the rooms like a shadow, cast by the daughter I once trusted to see me, only to find that she chose to see something else entirely. It was shortly after the guests arrived that I overheard her, my daughter, speaking softly to one of the women from her husband's office. Their voices were just above a whisper, but I caught every word with the clarity of a heartbreaking. "Marta," she said, "has been with us for years. She helps keep everything running smoothly." The words landed like a hammer, blunt and heavy, stripping me bare in front of strangers. I was not a mother, not a grandmother, not family. I was a hired hand, an employee, a convenient prop to bolster the polished image my daughter wanted the world to see. The woman I had raised, nurtured, sacrificed for, was now willing to trade my name for a role that erased my existence. The realization hit me fully when a guest, one of the men from the firm, turned to me directly and asked, "How long have you worked here, Marta?" The question was innocent enough on the surface, but beneath it lay an assumption that stung sharper than any rebuke. I forced a smile, the kind of smile that hides the tremor in your hands and the ache in your chest, and replied quietly, "For many years. Many years. Years spent cooking, cleaning, caring. Years spent folding myself into the background while the people I loved celebrated their lives without me. I watched their faces, their polite nods, their quick glances away, and I understood that my story was no longer mine to tell. It belonged to the narrative my daughter crafted, the perfect image she presented to the world at her husband's side. The betrayal was not just in the words, but in the silence that followed. No one challenged her. No one offered me a chair or a kind look. I became a fixture in the room, like the expensive rug beneath my feet, noticed only for its presence, never its value. When the meal began, I served quietly, moving between the tables with practiced ease. But inside I was unraveling. Each polite, "Thank you, Marta," from a guest, felt like a reminder that I was a stranger in the house I had helped build. The daughter I once knew seemed distant, her smiles brittle, her eyes darting away when I sought even a flicker of recognition. It was a moment frozen in time, the moment I realized I had been carefully edited out of my own life. Later, when the last guest had left and the door closed behind them with a soft click, I found myself alone in the kitchen, the glow of the overhead light casting long shadows on the walls. The silence was oppressive, filled with the echoes of conversations that had left me behind. I took off the apron, folded it slowly, and placed it on the counter next to a framed photograph of my daughter as a child. Her bright eyes full of dreams, her small hand once held tightly in mine. That photograph was a relic of a past where I mattered, where my name was spoken with love and respect. Now it seemed like a memory from someone else's life. The catalyst that night was not a single act of cruelty, but a series of small, deliberate omissions. The absence of my name from introductions, the deliberate avoidance of eye contact, the careful construction of a narrative that erased me. It was a betrayal that unfolded slowly, like water wearing away stone, until there was nothing left of the woman who had once been the heart of that family. I realized that my daughter was not just hiding me from her guests. She was hiding me from herself, from the truth of what I had become in her eyes, a convenient illusion rather than a cherished mother. I remember standing by the window, watching the streetlights flicker outside as the night deepened. The house felt emptier than ever, even with the warmth of the oven still lingering in the air. I thought of the years I had poured into this family, the meals cooked at dawn, the endless laundry folded in the quiet hours, the sacrifices made without complaint, and I felt the weight of invisibility settle over me like a shroud. The daughter I loved had replaced me with a fiction, a story that served her need for control and image. And in that moment, I knew that the distance between us was no longer something I could cross with silence or patience. That night marked a turning point. It was the moment when the careful mask of family fell away, revealing the raw truth beneath. I was no longer seen as a person, but as a role to be played, a script to be followed. The catalyst was the daughter's betrayal, yes, but also my own awakening, the painful recognition that to reclaim myself, I would have to step out of the shadows she had cast. I could no longer be Marta the housekeeper, the silent helper, the erased mother. I had to find a way back to the woman who still lived beneath the weight of neglect, the woman who still remembered her name. As I stood alone in that quiet kitchen, I made a decision. The woman in the mirror, the one who wore the apron like armor, who moved through the rooms like a ghost, would not be the woman I was tomorrow. The daughter's words, the guest's assumptions, the silence that followed, they were a call to action, a spark that ignited a fire I thought had long since burned out. I would no longer allow myself to be invisible. I would no longer accept the role they had assigned me. The catalyst was not just a moment of betrayal. It was the first step toward reclaiming my story, my dignity, and my life. That night, before I went to bed, I took out the box where I kept the wedding dress my daughter had worn years ago, the dress I had helped mend with my own hands. I unfolded the delicate fabric, the lace and silk shimmering faintly in the dim light. I thought of the daughter who had once dreamed in that dress, the daughter who now refused to see me as anything but a shadow. And I whispered to myself, this dress is not just fabric. It is the memory of a woman who was seen, loved, and valued, and so am I. That whispered promise was the quiet beginning of a new chapter, one that I would write on my own terms, with no apologies, no excuses, and no erasures. The catalyst had done its work. It had broken the silence, shattered the illusion, and left me standing at the edge of a new path. I did not yet know where it would lead, but I knew one thing for certain. I would never again allow myself to be invisible. I would find my voice, my place, and my name, and I would wear that wedding dress, not as a symbol of what I had lost, but as a cloak of the woman I was becoming. After the night of the party, when the words housekeeper still echoed in my mind like a cruel refrain, the slow, relentless shift began. It was not marked by one dramatic moment, but by a series of small, almost imperceptible changes that added up to a chasm I could no longer ignore. The house I had once thought of as my home, The place where I raised my daughter and watched my grandchildren grow gradually became a place where I was expected to disappear. The photo albums I once filled with snapshots of birthdays, holidays, and quiet afternoons vanished from the shelves, replaced by glossy coffee table books and digital frames cycling through carefully curated images. My face was missing from the family's history, as if I had been erased with the flick of a hand. It started with the names. They stopped calling me Mom or Grandma in public, or even in private at times. Instead, I became Marta, or the helper, a subtle but piercing shift that reduced my identity to a role, a function. When I corrected my granddaughter gently one day, telling her, "I'm your abuela, not just the helper," she looked at me with confusion, as if I were asking her to believe in a fairy tale. The granddaughter who once ran into my arms and called me Grandma now hesitated at the door, afraid of what others might say, afraid of breaking the carefully constructed illusion her parents wanted to maintain. I saw the flicker of shame in her eyes, and it broke something inside me. The erasure continued in other ways. My clothes, the ones I had chosen for comfort and warmth, were quietly removed from my wardrobe and donated. My favorite sweaters, worn soft from years of use, disappeared, replaced by plain muted colors deemed more appropriate by my daughter. When I protested, she said it was because guests find bright colors distracting. But I knew it was because I had become a distraction. I was no longer the woman who had poured love into this family. I was a complication they preferred to hide. My presence had to be managed, controlled, minimized, until I was no more than a background detail in the story they told themselves and the world. I remember the afternoons spent sitting quietly in the kitchen, watching the family gather in the living room while I was asked to stay upstairs or rest during gatherings. It was a polite way of saying I wasn't welcome in the moments that mattered. I became invisible in plain sight, a ghost tethered to a house that no longer recognized me as its heart. The silence that filled those rooms was not peaceful. It was a vacuum that sucked away my sense of belonging and replaced it with a cold emptiness. I began to question myself. Was I imagining it? Was I overreacting to the subtle glances and hushed conversations? But then came the day I overheard my daughter telling a friend on the phone, "She's just here to help, you know. She doesn't really fit in anymore." The words confirmed what my heart already knew. I was being pushed out. Yet even as the weight of invisibility pressed down on me, I held on to the routines that connected me to my past and to myself. I continued to cook the meals that had fed my family for decades, folding tortillas with the same care, seasoning soups with memories steeped in love. But increasingly, these acts felt like echoes, reminders of a time when my hands shaped not just food, but the fabric of our family life. The kitchen, once the center of laughter and storytelling, became a place where I labored in solitude. My efforts met with polite nods or absent thanks. I was the invisible engine running quietly behind closed doors, fueling a life that no longer included me. The moments of quiet were punctuated by small humiliations that stung deeply because they were so ordinary, so mundane. I was asked to clear the table before the guests had even finished their drinks, told to tidy the living room while others relaxed. Invitations to family outings came with disclaimers. "You don't have to come if you're tired," which really meant, "We don't expect you." Birthdays passed without acknowledgement. Holidays celebrated in rooms where my seat was empty or invisible as sightseers. If I were a visitor, not the woman who had shaped those celebrations, the house was full. But I was not. There were days when I caught glimpses of myself in mirrors, older, more worn, and undeniably alone, and I wondered how I had come to be so small in a world I had helped create. I thought about the dreams I had shelved long ago, the quiet hopes buried beneath years of caregiving and sacrifice. The daughter I had raised was a stranger now, her smiles polite but distant, her words clipped and guarded. I realized that the housemaid they saw was a fiction they had invented to protect themselves from the messy truth of family, from the uncomfortable reality of a mother who was no longer convenient to their story. In those moments, I felt a fierce longing, not for revenge or confrontation, but for recognition. To be seen again, not as a ghost or a servant, but as a woman with a history, a heart, and a voice. The slow erosion of my place in the family was a pain deeper than any wound, a grief for a life that was slipping through my fingers. And yet, amidst the quiet despair, a small ember of resolve began to glow. I was not ready to disappear completely. The woman who had given everything to this family was still here, still breathing, still waiting for a chance to reclaim her story. I began to spend more time alone, walking the neighborhood, visiting the little park where the children once played, sitting on a bench watching the world move without me. The seasons changed, the leaves turning gold and then falling, mirroring the slow shedding of the life I had known. But in the turning of the world, I found a strange comfort, a reminder that change was possible, that endings could lead to beginnings. The daughter who had dismissed me was not the only one who could change. I could find a new way forward, a new identity beyond the roles they assigned me. One afternoon, as I sat in the quiet of my room, I opened a box of forgotten things, a collection of old letters, photographs, and the delicate wedding dress my daughter had worn so many years ago. The fabric was soft and worn, yet it held the weight of memories, of promises made and broken. I touched the lace gently, feeling the threads that connected me to a past I was no longer sure I belonged to. That dress was a symbol of a life once shared, of love and hope, and the slow unraveling that had followed. It was also a reminder of who I had been, and who I could still become. The first escalation was not a loud upheaval, but a quiet dismantling, a subtle but relentless fading into the background of a family that had stopped needing me. It was the stripping away of my identity piece by piece, until I was left to wonder if I still had one. But it was also the stirring of a new awareness, a flicker of something stubborn and bright beneath the layers of neglect. I was not yet ready to be erased. I was beginning to see the cracks in the walls they had built around me, and with each breath, I felt the first tentative steps toward reclaiming my place in the world. Not as a ghost, not as a helper, but as myself. The turning point came quietly, without fanfare or announcement, in the small hours of a restless night when the house was empty and the world outside held its breath beneath a heavy sky. I found myself in the dusty storage room, the forgotten corner of the house where time seemed to stand still, and there, beneath a faded tarp and a stack of boxes, I discovered the wedding dress. It was folded carefully, as if waiting for me to remember. The fabric was delicate, soft with age, embroidered with lace that traced the outlines of a dream long since faded. I touched it reverently, the weight of years pressing gently on my fingertips, and in that moment, I felt the old Marta stir, a woman who had once dreamed beyond the walls of this house, who had believed in love, in family, in herself. I took the dress into my arms and carried it upstairs to my room, where the walls were bare and the light was dim. Alone, I slipped out of the muted clothes that had become my uniform of invisibility and carefully stepped into the dress. The fabric brushed against my skin like a whisper from the past, and I looked at myself in the mirror, not as a forgotten helper, but as the woman I once was. I saw the lines etched by time on my face, the silver threads woven through my hair, but beneath it all was a strength that had never truly left me. Wearing that dress, I felt a surge of defiance, a quiet rebellion against the erasure I had endured. It was not a cry for attention or a plea for pity, but a statement of existence. I was here. I was still here. The reflection in the mirror was not the fragile figure I had imagined myself to be. It was a woman who had given everything and still had something to give. The dress was more than fabric and thread. It was a symbol of what I had lost and what I could reclaim. I whispered to the woman in the glass, "You are not invisible." The words tasted like hope, bitter and sweet all at once, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. That night, I did not wait for anyone to notice or acknowledge me. I did not seek permission or approval. I stood in that dress, alone but unbowed, and made a silent promise to myself. The years of being unseen, unheard, and unvalued would not define me any longer. I would find my voice, and I would use it, even if it trembled at first. The dress was my armor and my declaration, a quiet fire burning beneath the surface of a life that had grown too cold. In the days that followed, something shifted within me. The routine of erasure and dismissal continued around me, but I began to move differently through the world. My steps were steadier, my gaze firmer. When my granddaughter called me the helper, I corrected her gently but firmly. When my daughter dismissed my presence at family gatherings, I found a way to be seen, not by confrontation, but by quiet assertion. I no longer moved like a ghost. I moved like a woman who knew she deserved to be in the light. I started small acts of rebellion. I wore the dress's delicate lace as a scarf, a secret reminder of the woman beneath the apron. I cooked with more care, setting the table for myself as much as for others, refusing to be invisible even in the simplest moments. I began to speak up in conversations, offering my thoughts and stories with a voice that, though soft, carried the weight of a lifetime. The house still whispered with the echoes of the past, but I was no longer willing to be a silent shadow in its halls. The shift was not sudden or dramatic. It was a slow unfolding, a steady reclaiming of self that grew stronger with each passing day. I found joy in small things: a walk in the park, the taste of fresh bread, the warmth of sunlight through the window. I reconnected with old friends who remembered the woman I was before the erasure. I reached out to neighbors, began to plant herbs on the windowsill, nurturing life in a space that had felt empty for too long. This was not a return to the past, but a step toward a new future. I was no longer the woman who waited for recognition from those who refused to give it. I was becoming the woman who gave herself permission to be seen, to be heard, to be loved on her own terms. The dress, once a symbol of lost dreams, had become a talisman of possibility. It reminded me that beneath the layers of neglect and silence, there was still a flame burning, a flame that would not be extinguished. I understood then that reclaiming my story would not be easy. There would be setbacks and pain, moments when the weight of invisibility threatened to pull me back into the shadows. But I was ready. I had found a strength in solitude and a courage in quiet defiance. The woman in the mirror was not the same as the one who had been pushed aside. She was stronger, wiser, and ready to face whatever came next. And so, wearing that dress, I began to live again. Not for anyone else, but for myself. I began to speak my truth, to claim my space, to walk with a dignity that no one could take away. The midpoint was not just a change in circumstance, but a transformation of spirit. It was the moment when I stopped waiting for others to see me and started seeing myself clearly for the first time in years. It was the moment I became whole again. The days that followed the quiet rebellion of the dress were filled with a strange mixture of hope and uncertainty, as though I were walking a narrow path between two worlds. One I was leaving behind, and one I had yet to fully enter. The house, once a sanctuary and later a prison of invisibility, began to feel like a battleground, where old wounds reopened and new challenges arose. The second escalation was not marked by a sudden outburst or confrontation, but by the slow, unrelenting pressure of the past, pressing against the fragile new life I was trying to build. It was a test of my resolve, a reminder that the road to reclaiming oneself is never easy or straightforward. One afternoon, as the light filtered softly through the lace curtains, a letter arrived. The envelope was thick, heavy with the weight of words I both dreaded and needed to hear. It was from my granddaughter, Kira, the one family member who had always seen me, not as a shadow, not as a role, but as herself. Her handwriting was careful, deliberate, the kind of handwriting that speaks of thought and care. She wrote of worry, of confusion, of nights spent wondering where I had gone. She begged me to come home, to call, to tell her I was safe. Her words were a lifeline tossed across the chasm that had grown between us, and I held the letter close, reading and rereading it until the edges softened in my hands. But the letter was also a reminder of the distance I had traveled, the physical miles between me and the house where I had been unseen, but also the emotional gulf that stretched wide and deep. I did not respond immediately. I was not yet ready to bridge that gap, to reopen wounds that were still healing. The letter was a small spark of connection, but it was also a test. Could I forgive the silence, the betrayal, the years of neglect? Could I return to a family that had so thoroughly erased me? For now, the answer was no. But the letter gave me something precious, hope that the ties of blood, though frayed, were not entirely severed. Around the same time, another presence re-entered my life, a visitor I had not expected. Lisa, my daughter, appeared at the cafe where I had begun to rebuild a life of my own, working quietly among strangers who knew nothing of my past. She was different than I remembered, tighter, more polished, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. There was a hesitation in her step, as if she were unsure whether she belonged in this new world I was creating, or if she even wanted to. She stood stiffly by the pastry display, pretending to read the chalkboard menu, avoiding my gaze until I finally turned to face her. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice low and strained, as though the words themselves were a confession. I nodded and led her to a quiet booth in the corner. The cafe was nearly empty, just the soft murmur of other patrons and the distant hiss of the espresso machine filling the space between us. Lisa's eyes searched mine, looking for something I was not sure I was willing to give. She spoke of panic and fear, of the family's worry when they realized I was gone, of the chaos that had erupted in my absence. She said she never intended to hurt me, that she was trying to protect the family's image, to keep everything from unraveling. But her words felt hollow, rehearsed, and I saw behind them the familiar armor of denial and control. When I reminded her of the night she introduced me as Marta, our longtime housekeeper, her face flushed with embarrassment, but she did not apologize. Instead, she asked for forgiveness in a way that felt more like a transaction than a true reckoning, a hope that I would return quietly, accept the diminished role, and restore the illusion of family harmony. But I was no longer that woman. The wounds were too deep, the betrayals too many. I told her gently but firmly that I would not go back to a life where my name was a secret and my presence a convenience. The visit was a storm of emotions: anger, sorrow, regret, and a faint glimmer of understanding. Lisa left before the coffee was finished, leaving me alone with the bitter aftertaste of a conversation that changed nothing. The family's attempts to reclaim me felt like grasping at shadows, desperate and ineffective. I was no longer theirs to control. Not long after Lisa's visit, a package arrived. A thin envelope with no return address, the kind of thing that sets a heart racing with both fear and curiosity. Inside was a letter from Adam, my son, a letter that laid bare the family's version of events. He accused me of abandoning them, of making a scene by disappearing without warning, of causing stress during what was supposed to be a joyous vacation. His words were sharp, cold, and carefully measured to paint me as unreasonable and selfish. He wrote of Lisa's tears, the children's confusion, the chaos I had left in my wake, but there was no mention of the hours I had waited alone in the airport lounge, no acknowledgement of the silent rejection that had pushed me away. Reading his letter, I felt a mix of emotions: hurt, disbelief, and a profound sense of betrayal. It was as if all the love I had poured into this family was being rewritten as a story of abandonment and tantrums. The legal tone of his words, the thinly veiled threats, wrapped in concern, made it clear that the family was preparing to fight for control, to assert their version of the truth as the only one that mattered. But I refused to be drawn into their game. I folded the letter carefully and placed it aside, a symbol of the final barrier between us. In the midst of this turmoil, my world grew in unexpected ways. Arthur, a quiet man I had met at the cafe, became a steady presence, a reminder that connection could be found outside the confines of family and old wounds. His kindness was simple but profound, a steady anchor in the shifting tides of my life. We talked of birds and books, of small things that mattered, and in his company, I found a balm for the loneliness that had threatened to consume me. Arthur did not ask for explanations or apologies. He simply offered friendship and a quiet acceptance that I had not known I needed. The family's efforts to reclaim me grew more desperate. Lawyers appeared at the cafe, formal letters arrived, and phone calls came with increasing urgency and veiled threats. They questioned my well-being, my choices, and my capacity to live independently. But I stood firm, supported by the small but growing network of people who saw me for who I truly was. I had learned to say no, to demand respect and recognition on my own terms. The daughter and son who had once silenced me now faced a woman who would not be silenced again. The crescendo of this escalation was not a shouting match or a dramatic confrontation, but a quiet, unyielding refusal to return to a life of invisibility. When a lawyer came to speak on behalf of my family, I listened with calm resolve and told him plainly that I was not a pet to be controlled or a problem to be solved. I was a woman of sound mind, living in a safe environment, and any further attempts to contact me under the guise of concern would be considered harassment. It was a declaration of independence, a legal and emotional boundary that could not be crossed. In the weeks that followed, I continued to build a life that belonged to me alone. I took on extra shifts at the cafe, walked new neighborhoods, and slowly reclaimed the joy of small pleasures. The ache in my feet and hands was a reminder of my resilience, each step a testament to my refusal to be broken. I found solace in cooking, in tending to a small garden window box, and in the company of those who welcomed me without conditions. The second escalation was a crucible that tested my strength and forced me to confront the ghosts of my past, but it also revealed the depth of my courage and the power of choice. The family I had lost was still part of my story, but no longer the author. I was writing new chapters, ones filled with honesty, dignity, and the quiet defiance of a woman who would not be erased. The path was not easy, and the wounds were still raw, but I walked it with my head held high, wrapped in the knowledge that I was no longer alone, no longer invisible, and no longer silent. The moment of climax was not heralded by fanfare or shouting. It arrived quietly, with the subtle weight of finality that only those who have borne years of silence and invisibility can understand. It was a moment born not out of anger but out of a deep and steady resolve, the kind that grows from the soil of countless small betrayals and the slow, painful reclaiming of oneself. I remember the evening clearly, the air heavy with the scent of rain and the distant hum of the city settling into night. The house, once filled with the bustling noise of family life, now felt like a stage where I was no longer an actor but a ghost, unseen, unheard, forgotten. Yet on that night, I decided I would no longer be a ghost. I had been asked again to serve a family dinner, the latest in a string of social gatherings where my presence was tolerated only because I was useful. The guests were expected, the house prepared with the precision of a theater set, each detail arranged to perfection. The daughter, with her rehearsed smile and sharp eyes, motioned me to put on the apron and get to work. It was the same old script: the silent servant, the invisible mother. But inside me, something had shifted irreversibly. I did not move with the quiet submission I once knew. I did not wear the mask of compliance as easily. That night, I wore something else beneath the apron: a memory, a symbol, a statement. The wedding dress I had found and worn in solitude, now hidden under the simple fabric that everyone expected me to wear. As the guests arrived, the house hummed with polite conversation and laughter, the clinking of glasses and the rustle of fine fabric. I moved through the rooms, carrying dishes with steady hands, serving salads, pouring wine, attending to needs without a word. But unlike before, my heart was not heavy with invisibility. Instead, it was alight with a quiet fire, a flame fed by years of silence now ready to burn through the veils of neglect. I was no longer just the help. I was a woman reclaiming her dignity, her history, her right to be seen. The evening progressed, the meal was served, and the guests murmured their compliments, unaware of the storm beneath the surface. Then, in a moment that seemed to suspend time, I stepped into the dining room, carrying the final course. The room fell quieter, a hush descending as I moved to the center, the soft rustle of the dress beneath my apron catching a few glances. Slowly, deliberately, I removed the apron and laid it on the polished wooden table, the fabric whispering like a secret in the dim light. There was a pause, a breath held, a flicker of confusion and surprise in the eyes of the guests and my daughter alike. I stood tall, the dress flowing around me like a mantle of years past and promises unkept. I looked at my daughter, who sat frozen in a seat she once claimed as her own, her smile faltering for the first time. "This will be the last meal I serve in a home that forgot my name," I said softly, my voice steady and clear, carrying across the room like a bell tolling for the end of silence. The words hung in the air, heavy with truth and finality. No one spoke. No one moved. The room was thick with the weight of all the years of unspoken pain and erased memories. Then I turned and walked away, each step deliberate, each movement a reclaiming of space that had long been denied me. I did not slam the door behind me, nor did I wait for apologies or tears. I packed my bag slowly, carefully, as though each folded garment was a piece of myself being gathered and saved. I left the house not as a defeated woman, but as one who had finally found her voice, who had drawn the line between what was and what could never be again. Outside, the night air was cool and fresh, a balm to my raw skin and bruised spirit. I breathed deeply, feeling the weight of years lift slightly from my shoulders. I walked without looking back, my footsteps echoing softly on the pavement, a steady rhythm marking the path of a woman who had taken back her story. The house, with its empty rooms and polished surfaces, was behind me now, a place that had held memories but had also tried to hold me down. I was free. In the weeks that followed, the world outside seemed brighter, more open, filled with possibility. I found a small apartment where the walls were my own, where the light poured in through simple curtains, and the sounds of the city became a soothing backdrop rather than a reminder of isolation. I began to fill my days with things I had long neglected: reading, gardening, walking in the park where the trees whispered stories of renewal and resilience. I reconnected with old friends and found new ones, people who saw me as I was, not as a shadow or a role. The letter from my granddaughter came again, this time filled with hope rather than worry. We spoke on the phone, her voice trembling with emotion and relief. She said she missed me, that she wished things had been different, and I told her gently that while the past could not be changed, the future was ours to write. We made plans to see each other, to rebuild bridges that had been damaged but not destroyed. It was a beginning, a tentative, fragile, beautiful beginning. The daughter's attempts to reach me grew more desperate, But I no longer responded with fear or silence. I set boundaries with a calm firmness that surprised even myself. I told her that I loved her, but that I loved myself more, that I would not return to a life where my worth was measured by my usefulness or my silence. She did not understand at first, but slowly, over time, even she began to see that the woman she had tried to erase was stronger than she had ever imagined. The wedding dress hung in my closet, a symbol not of what had been lost, but of what had been found. It reminded me every day that I was not invisible, that I was not forgotten, and that I had the power to define my own story. The climax of my journey was not a dramatic confrontation, but a quiet, irrevocable act of self-assertion, a woman standing in her own light, refusing to be diminished any longer. I was no longer just the helper, the shadow, the forgotten mother. I was myself, whole, proud, and unbreakable. In the quiet aftermath of all that had passed, I found myself settling into a rhythm that was unfamiliar yet deeply comforting. The sharp edges of betrayal and loss softened into something gentler, a calm acceptance that came not from forgetting the past, but from choosing to live beyond it. The small apartment where I now lived smelled of old books and fresh coffee, a space that was mine in every sense of the word. Here, I was no longer the woman hidden behind roles or the invisible helper, but simply myself, a woman with a history, scars, and a newfound sense of freedom. The mornings began with sunlight filtering through thin curtains, casting warm patterns across the floor. I made coffee in a chipped mug I had found at a second-hand store, the ritual simple but grounding. Sometimes I would sit by the window, watching the world move outside while I traced the lines of my own story in the quiet. The loneliness that had once pressed heavily upon me had lifted, replaced by a solitude that felt like a choice rather than a sentence. I was learning to be alone without feeling invisible. One afternoon, the doorbell rang softly. I opened the door to find a neighbor, a woman from down the hall whom I had exchanged nods with but never spoken to. She held a bundle of fabric in her hands, a dress she wanted altered. "I heard you used to cook for a big family," she said with a shy smile. "Maybe you could teach me sometime?" Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that surprised me. It was an invitation, a bridge, a reminder that connections could be built anew on different terms. I smiled back, a real smile that reached my eyes and said, "Only if you call me by my name." It was a small moment, but it felt like a victory, a reclaiming of identity and respect that no one could take away. This new life I was building was not grand or perfect, but it was honest, and it was mine. I was no longer defined by what I had lost or what others had decided for me. I was defined by the choices I made each day to live fully and authentically. The letters from my granddaughter, Kira, came more frequently now. We spoke often, sharing stories and laughter, rebuilding the bond that had frayed but never truly broken. There was no rush, no pressure, only a gentle unfolding of love and understanding. The wounds of the past were still there, but they no longer controlled the present. I found peace in the spaces between words, in the quiet presence of connection without expectation. Sometimes I thought of my daughter, of the woman who had tried to erase me, and I felt a complex swirl of emotions: sadness, disappointment, but also a deep compassion. I understood that her actions were born of fear and control, not cruelty. We were both trapped in roles we had inherited and struggled to escape, but I knew that my path was different now. I would not be drawn back into the shadows. I had stepped into the light, and I would stay there. In the evenings, I often sat by the window with a book in my lap, the world outside dimming into twilight. The apartment was quiet except for the soft ticking of a clock and the occasional distant sound of footsteps in the hallway. I wrapped myself in a shawl I had knitted, feeling the warmth seep into my bones. These moments of stillness were precious, a sanctuary where I could breathe and simply be. The wedding dress, once a symbol of loss and invisibility, now hung in my closet like a trophy of survival and self-discovery. It reminded me daily that I was not defined by the roles others had assigned me, but by the strength and dignity I claimed for myself. I had worn it once more, not for a party or a performance, but as a quiet declaration of identity and resilience. It was a garment woven with memories, pain, hope, and the unyielding will to live on my own terms. If this story reaches you, if you find yourself in the shadows cast by others who refuse to see you, know this: you are not invisible. You are not forgotten. You are the author of your own story, the keeper of your own light. It is never too late to reclaim your name, your dignity, your life. You do not need anyone's permission to be seen, to be heard, to be loved, especially by yourself. I am still here, still standing, still choosing every day to live with courage and grace. And if you are ready to take that step, to walk out of the silence and into your own light, then I will be here, waiting to hear your story, to share in your strength, to remind you that you are never alone.